Hi folks, and welcome to the last installment of S.O.A.P, Cleaning Up Your Daily Documentation. My name is John Adamson. I am the Rehab Documentation Guru, and today we're going to talk about P, or plan. This is obviously a very important component, like all the components of S.O.A.P. So what do we want to do for this particular piece of the documentation? Well, the big thing we want to document related to P is the fact that we're progressing the patient in some way. You see, Medicare or whatever insurer that you're dealing with does not want to see plans such as continue per plan of care. Because you know what that means? That means a static plan that can probably be at some point taught to somebody else and taken over by a non-skilled entity. I'll give you a good example of that. This is related to the medical field. I have a son until just a few days ago had a trach. And he had been on a ventilator, had a tracheostomy, had the trach put in place. Thank God he progressed well and got to the point where he didn't need the trach anymore. And but with that, we took him home, and he needed regular trach changes about once a week. Well, both my 17-year-old and my 14-year-old daughter were trained on and were quite proficient in changing that trach. Now, when we started off, they were not. But with repetition and training, they were able to take over what had been a skilled component of my son's care, and they made it into a non-skilled portion of the patient's of his care. And so they were able to do that now. And so if you say continue per plan of care, what I see is a static plan that probably could be trained to somebody else. So rather, what do I want to see? I want to see progress. I want to see things changed. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that I'm going to go off the wall with some new CPT code that had nothing to do with objective findings that I had for the patient. But it is going to relate back to the long-term goal. So, for example, if the patient was accepting challenges, let's say, with a certain diet texture, and it was becoming easier for them to do it, in fact, they were doing it just fine. Well, a plan might be for an upgrade to the diet or upgraded diet trials for the patient to handle on their next treatment session because they've progressed along. And who is it that can only safely and effectively do that? Well, in this case, it would be the speech therapist that can only safely and or effectively do that. So it's important that we don't demonstrate a static plan that can be eventually carried over by non-skilled personnel. We want to make sure that we are demonstrating that our skills are needed on a daily basis, and when the patient comes back for the next treatment, they're going to still need our special skills and knowledge to safely and or effectively deliver the care, because otherwise it is not skilled at that point. And one last point I would say about plan, and this has a lot to do with assistants, because oftentimes they're seeing the patient on the next to last visit before the registered therapist gets back in. Never, ever, ever say in your plan or somewhere in the note, the patient's met all goals, and the therapist is going to be seeing them next visit to DC. Well, what does that tell the insurance? Well, the last visit's not needed. And so we need to make sure that on the plan, we're leaving at least one goal in that case for the therapist to address on that last discharge visit, because otherwise there's no reason for that therapist to get in there in the first place. Anyway, that concludes our series on S.O.A.P, Cleaning Up Your Daily Documentation. My name is John Adamson, the Rehab Documentation Guru. I thank you for joining me. Please subscribe to my channel, but most importantly, go out and get paid for what you do. Thank you, and have a great day.